Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Don. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. My guest today is Neal Beggan of Cherry Bekaert, who is going to be talking to us about the first class of assessors for CMMC certified assessors. Want to let everyone know we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base, and they are available on demand on our website after the today's session. Our focus as a managed service provider is on organizations seeking certification, so I think that represents most of you in the audience. If you have some questions during this session, please send them in on the Q&A window within Zoom, and I will try to work as many of those audience questions in as I can during the session today. I want to introduce Neal Beggan. So Neal is a principal in the Risk Advisory Services Group at Cherry Bekaert. He's been doing audit and advisory work with Cherry Bekaert, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and others for a little over 20 years. And he holds multiple professional certifications in this space, including ISACA, Institute of Internal Auditors, High Trust, and now CMMC accreditation body. So Neal was a member of that first group to be trained as CMMC assessors by the CMMC accreditation body under their Provisional Assessor program. We had a session a couple weeks ago with Katie Arrington, nominally head of CMMC for all of DoD, and Katie was definitely making a point about the exciting news of having assessors trained and certified by the accreditation body. So if you didn't catch that session, by the way, please check out our website and listen to it on demand. It's pretty interesting news from Katie. But today, Neal, as one of the participants in that training, hopefully going to give us kind of the inside scoop. What's the training about? What are assessors going to do? And what, most importantly, I think for all of us is what can we expect when we go through the audit process? Before I start, I want to say in full disclosure that Neal's firm, Cherry Bekaert, performs the SOC audits for us here at NeoSystems. So today we're going to be very careful, Neal, right, not to cause any independence issues for that. So
that's right. Appreciate that, Ed.
Keep it safe. So Neal, thanks for joining us today. Definitely a big deal that we have some trained CMMC assessors. Like I say, we've all been waiting, for the details of that assessment process and what we can expect. So let me start by, I guess, finding out how you became involved in this. So my understanding is that the intent of this first provisional class was to test drive the training and give some feedback to the CMMC accreditation body. So why did you apply for this provisional class, and how were you selected? Was this some highly competitive lottery drawing, prior experience of which you have a lot? What was, what came about to get you in this first class?
Sure. So for my own ego, I'll say it was extremely competitive, but in all honesty, it's something that we thought was important from Cherry Bekaert's perspective. We obviously serve the GovCon community and have numerous clients and folks in our network that CMMC is going to impact in the coming years. So something that we knew we wanted to get out in front of as early as possible. So in applying for C3PO status, as well as registered practitioner organization status, we also jumped at the chance for the provisional program. So I did apply at an individual level. There was some criteria to meet in terms of, you mentioned kind of experience. There was a minimum amount of experience that was required, but they also asked about background in terms of what you've actually done in or related to not only the cybersecurity realm, compliance realm, and some other areas. So put that application through. As you mentioned, I was luckily accepted as one of, I believe there's roughly 73, it could be off by a number or two, nationwide that were selected. These folks represent everything from individual independent contractors all the way up to organizations or affiliated with larger organizations that will be C3PAOs. Just a point of clarification, I know we'll have probably a couple disclaimers, as you mentioned, over the next 30 minutes, because this is still a moving target. I was part of what is called the second cohort. So there's really three. The first one went through at the end of August, early September. My class went through last week, and the third cohort will go through at the end of October, and that will, with those three, will combine the 73 individuals that will be the provisional assessors.
Got it. So Yeah, tell me a little bit more about this provisional assessor program. So this is training essentially people who already have skills in the area. As you mentioned, there's experience. And I think as we progress, we're going to see the CMMC accreditation body trying to train people who may be coming at this new at the start of their career. What's the intent of this provisional program, and how does it fit into the overall plans of the accreditation body to build out their ecosystem of assessors and others?
Yeah, sure. And of those individuals selected, I talked about background a little bit in speaking from the roughly 25 folks that were in my class, largely made up of folks similar to myself that have dedicated their career to IT security, cybersecurity, information security, compliance areas, and so forth. You kind of talk about that alphabet soup, and we had folks in there represented, with a background in CMMI, ISO, other NIST-based standards, folks like myself with SOC, SOC, audit experience, and high trust audit. So it really ran the gamut from an experience perspective. But again, the intent was to be able to have folks that are well-versed in this arena, be able to provide feedback really every step of the way. So you think about where we are now in the actual training of assessors, this provisional assessment program, they're really looking for feedback on how it's delivered, the content covered, the length and duration and format that it's delivered, obviously if there's areas of improvement and so forth, and that's just in the training. Then there's second pieces with the exam, and then certainly once you become a provisional assessor and align yourself with this first round of C3PAOs, the actual organizations that will do the assessments themselves, they're looking for feedback constantly throughout the process to really better it for the larger audience, anticipated, end of this year, early next, when things really get going.
Cool. So which CMMC levels were addressed by this first round of training, and if not all of them, what are the plans for the higher levels?
So the focus on the training and kind of the way it's given is both individual study and coursework, kind of prerequisite work, and then it is in person, obviously virtual at this point, but instructor-led training for a number of days to cover a number of things, the process, as well as digging into the model and so forth. To answer your question, the focus at this point is on levels 1 through 3. As you know, from the model perspective, has remained largely unchanged since version 1 was released in January from the model, and the associated controls with level 4 and 5. But the details of kind of the criteria and guides of how to audit organizations at that level is to be developed. And I think a lot of that is going to come from the feedback over the next few months of these provisional assessments that are anticipated to cover levels 1 up to level 3.
Got it. So fair to say that you've been following the evolution of CMMC pretty carefully. You're immersed in the business, a big piece of your business probably driven by these requirements. So how, if at all, how have your impressions of CMMC changed as a result of the training? Were there surprises, things you didn't expect, any change-ups that came, or was it more a confirmation of what we've already seen out there?
I'll tell you from a personal perspective, and I think I can speak to others kind of even within industry, and certainly there's been some bumps along the road, many of which would be expected with an undertaking like this, but I was extremely surprised at the level of detail, the level of effort that's gone into even this provisional program that the AB has put forth. So the AB, recognizing they were only, they were stood up back in Q4 of, I can't remember if it was November or December. It was pretty late last year. And then taking into consideration everything that's happened in 2020 with COVID and everything else, the amount of information that they've been able to put together and really, in essence, deliver, even with my class being the second class through it, was nothing short of impressive. I think we've all, those involved directly in the industry or like NeoSystems and Cherry Bekaert supporting the industry, all believe in the intent of CMMC and all believe in the desired outcome of CMMC to protect the DIB. But when I have to be completely honest, I mean, I could say this coming out of NeoSystems events when we were attending those in person and kind of talking around, the quote unquote water cooler with people. And it was just a conversation of, there's no way this is going to happen. When you start doing the math, there's no way that they can do this. There's no way that this is going to get stood up or this model solidified. So the surprises have been continual in the sense that, for the most part, I mean, COVID withstanding, they've met the mark pretty well along the way. Certainly, there's areas of improvement. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, myself included. But again, even the intent of the provisional program to solicit and act upon improvements, I think shows that they do have the right intent and are staying with the original intent, which I think will be good for everyone.
That's good to hear. And I mean, there's nothing harder than bringing in experienced people, senior in their career, and trying to train them, right? I mean, trying to teach experts how to do things, and that's a really high bar, in the sense of the level of critical analysis and probably constructive criticism you might get from that audience. So to hear you saying positive things about it is, it speaks to the hard work that went into it. So as I guess I want to think about this as it compares to some other things that are out there. So yeah, you are an experienced assessor. You're used to complying with specific assessment standards, AICPA, high trust, et cetera. So assessment rigor and the idea of doing this in a controlled way is nothing new. How does CMMC assessments compare to those other sorts of assessments? And specifically, is there anything new or unusual that we should expect in the CMMC assessments?
Yeah, so little known secret, and I always make the joke that we don't let this on to my CPA counterparts, is that, within the IT field, I think of it as one big Venn diagram, so you have all those different areas. You mentioned high trust and ISO and NIST-based standards, which, oh, by the way, many of which were used to develop CMMC. High trust itself was actually cobbled together with ISO and some NIST-based standards, obviously NIST being the overriding component of CMMC. So the reason I say that is there is somewhat significant overlap between all of these different compliance areas. I always just tell people it's at which point and how much. CMMC being no different, obviously, for folks familiar with NIST 800-171 by way of DFAR 7012, for example, all of those controls being implemented across the levels based on which level you're doing. Obviously, when you get up to level 3, all 110 controls are there. So there is a lot of similarity in terms of the content. Now, the scope in terms of where this data, that is really the intent to protect, be it FCI, the federal contract information, or the CUI, controlled unclassified information, as you get up to the upper levels, where that is housed, transmitted, received, processed, and potentially created and so forth, provides a little uniqueness to it. But probably the overriding difference, I would say, between CMMC and some other areas is really this concept of complete pass-fail, which the DoD has really doubled down on, even more recently. And certainly you mentioned the recent town hall you had with Katie, where I know that came up again. And
she doubled down. Yep.
Right. And that had been somewhat of a gray area at the beginning of whether or not, you could potentially have open items on a POAM and still receive a certification. And obviously that answer now is definitively no. Could that change as a result of the provisional assessment program? That's a pretty big change. I don't know that it'll get to that level, but certainly it will be something that folks provide feedback on. But Ed, you mentioned, I've been doing this type of work for over 20 years, and you yourself have been involved as well for that time, maybe a little longer, if I can make a little joke, because I've known Ed for a little bit.
I am older.
So in that 20 plus years, I mean, I've never seen a system that is 100% perfect 100% of the time. And so when you think about what could be different with CMMC with this complete pass fail, are there opportunities to resolve issues prior to certification? Yes, and I think we should address that maybe even after this question. But this concept of pass fail, that you cannot have any open items, that's really going to be a change for a lot of folks, especially folks that maybe their introduction to CMMC is coming on the heels of just DFAR 7012, where you just had a self-assessment. And everyone knows a self-assessment can be a little lighter, obviously, than a required third-party assessment or audit or certification. Other folks that maybe have gone through, adjacent services like ISO compliance or CMMI or PCI or SOC that are a little bit more probably mature in their audit readiness, maybe a little different, but for folks that have never been through something, a third-party certification that is completely pass-fail at the end of the day, that's a pretty big deal, especially with the implications of that. That, you know, you talk about contracts being won or lost, or being able to be awarded or satisfy a contract. It puts a lot of scrutiny, pressure, you know, you fill in the blank, on the organizations, but also the folks helping them prepare, as well as the folks doing the assessments themselves. So long-winded answer, but I would say pass-fail is probably the biggest difference that's going to impact the majority of folks.
Thanks, Neal. And I want to circle back on the pass-fail concept, as well as the boundary setting your scope. And I have a few audience questions on that. But first, I want to stay kind of at a high level about the audit experience and think about the preparation for that that happens before the auditor gets there, based on what you know now about how the audit is going to proceed. So as a service provider, you know, NeoSystems, we're in the business of passing audits on behalf of our clients, right? So we're typically in there in the upfront getting ready phase, as well as the audit itself. For many in the audience today that are working towards CMMC, this is going to be the first time they've had this kind of external scrutiny on their cybersecurity, right? So if you're a cloud service provider and you've been through FedRAMP or you've been through HITRUST, then you know this may not be that new an experience. But for many in the DoD contractor world, there hasn't been something like this where an assessor outside, independent, came in and looked at your cybersecurity. As you mentioned, we've been in the self-assessment or self-attestation world since DFARS 7012 came out. So I guess, what can we expect from that assessment in terms of how they'll be carried out, and what level of knowledge, experience, and training we can expect from the assessors? So what's that sort of on the ground experience going to be like for us as people being assessed?
Yeah, and I'll back up, because I think there's, if you can think about it almost in three phases, I think there's probably two before you get to the assessment. So the first would be some sort of, and the names get thrown around and are used interchangeably, and CMMC speaks to it a little differently than we would at Cherry Bekaert, but you have this concept of a readiness assessment or pre-assessment, and one comes before the other in my mind, but it's a little different before you get to the assessment itself. And what I mean by that is the organizations seeking certification obviously should be getting out in front of it, and we'll talk about what folks can do to do that here in a little bit. But when you talk about performing a pre-assessment, kind of that self-assessment check versus having an external party come in and help, and Ed, you mentioned for some of the smaller to mid-sized folks that maybe have never had to go through anything like this before, and/or just went through DFARS, did a self-assessment in-house, you know, got a working SSP and a current state POAM, and kind of checked the box and met those requirements versus what CMMC has in store. You think about the prep that's going to need to go into it, depending on the level. There's a huge lift just in documentation for level 3. So you talk about those processes that you have to do in addition to meeting the requirements in order to demonstrate the given levels of maturity. When you start thinking about things like documentation, having every domain documented with corresponding resource plans and addressing each control requirement and so forth, that's a lot. And it's going to be a lot for folks. And we always talk about the, you know, internal burden on resources, because you know it as well as anybody in your role as a CISO. I mean, you have your normal day to day. And when things like this get piled on, and there is an ultimate impact of being able to, or you know, being able to be awarded to an RFP that you responded, there's going to be a lot of pressure. So we can't stress enough, folks that are working currently with the DoD, that anticipate working with the DoD, and it probably won't be too long before we keep DoD out of the conversation in case it rolls past the civilian agencies in the years to come. But for right now, for those folks, getting out in front is paramount. So the process really from a pre-assessment is getting your house in order. If you've been through a DFARS assessment, you know, taking a look at that POAM, closing out any items. Obviously, the model is public information. You can go out and see the requirements based on the levels, you know, start reviewing your contracts, currently anticipated contracts, whether or not that would justify pursuing a different, an increased level of maturity and so forth. And then reaching out to folks that can help you prepare if you don't have those resources in-house. And when I say resources in-house, that's not only skill set. I mean, there's plenty of folks that are well-versed in NIST 800-171 or well-versed in many of the different disciplines around IT compliance, but again, they have day-to-day jobs. So unless they're able to dedicate a significant portion of the time to this, it may be something worth looking at a third party. The other thing is recognizing relationships. So you talked about even your role, Ed, in the role of NeoSystems and helping organizations by taking some of this burden off. We always talk about, outsourcing can mean a lot of things, and ideally, as a result of outsourcing certain operations, you should be outsourcing some risk. And so, utilizing your third parties and recognizing the roles of those third parties, like NeoSystems and so forth, what it is they're doing, what they're not, what they're responsible for, what they're not, where the data is, who has ownership and administration of it, getting all of that, as I mentioned, kind of your house in order, is going to be paramount for folks. And that can be really surprising. I mean, you guys know in the field you're in, and we, by conducting cyber readiness and risk assessments, it's amazing what folks just aren't aware of that are within their walls, physically or logically. So,
yeah.
And then the shape and then the assessment. Sorry, I know that was long-winded. Let me just finish on the actual assessment. Those that have been through third-party certifications, audits, and so forth, I think the process is going to be very similar in terms of requesting information, interviews, testing, examining evidence, performing testing, and so forth. For anybody that's been through audits and certifications before, once you get to that stage, it should be fairly familiar for you. One thing to keep in mind, which is somewhat unique, and I didn't touch on it on my earlier question, but kind of the differences is a C3PAO, for example, we merely kind of sit in the middle. So much like High Trust, we're kind of a middleman between the OSCs and, in this case, the AB. So we are not issuing the certification, which is interesting for folks, and some that maybe haven't been on some of your town halls would not be aware of that. At the end of the day, the AB actually issues the certification. We merely are conducting independent work and making a recommendation, much like High Trust for anybody that's been through that. But conversely, SOC audits, the amount of those we do a year, the AICPA isn't issuing the SOC opinion. A CPA within Cherry Bekaert is doing that. So that would be a difference that I should have touched on earlier too.
Got it. Thanks. And I appreciate the mention about, kind of outsourcing or moving some of that risk, right? As a service provider that's helping people to pass their CMMC audits, we really take ownership of, meeting the auditors, the assessors' expectations, right? So, I mean, I think in that sense, you outsource sort of the heavy lifting of creating documents and that sort of thing, but also in some extent, the risk of failure, in the sense that it's on those people that you bring in to do that. It's on them to understand what's going to be needed and make sure it's all ready for the audit. And once the audit starts, there's limited amount of assistance the auditor can provide and limited amount of time. I think there's like a 60-day window in which you can accept remediation without having to start the audit over again. Is that?
It's actually, as of now, it's 90 days.
Oh, 90 days. Sorry, excuse me. Yep.
And that at this point is going to be up to the discretion of the C3PAO assessors.
Got it.
So that's not something that, say you fail to control and we submit it up to the accreditation board and they review it and say, okay, yeah, if they fix that, no problem. That actually happens before it gets to the AB.
Okay.
Before, for those, familiar with FedRAMP and, kind of these ATO packages that you put together, or an object in High Trust and give it to the in this case, the accreditation body. All of that will happen ahead of time. So the assessment will go through. If there happen to be failures, it will be up to, at this point, the judgment of the, at this point, provisional assessor, but soon to be certified assessor, and the C3PAO to determine whether or not those controls could and should be remediated within a 90-day period prior to being submitted up to the AB for consideration for certification.
Got it. So I want to circle back to a topic you brought up a minute ago on boundary, and I got a bunch of questions from the audience on this. I'll try to work those in here together. So CMMC allows the organizations seeking certification to define their own boundary for the certification. They can do the entire enterprise, they can do that portion that's involved with DoD work, or even specific enclaves. And this is somewhat codified in the new DFARS rule, but there's not a lot of details there about how that works. I mean, I think the notion is that we've heard, and is somewhat in that interim rule, is follow the data. Where the data is stored and processed, that stuff needs to be in scope. And if you don't store and process data on a system, it's not. But the standard is not very clear, at least not to me, on how contractors have to segregate that system between those things that are, included in the certification and those things, those parts of the company that are not. How big of a role does the assessor play in validating that boundary? And in cases where CMMC only applies to some of the enterprise, say an enclave, what level of segregation are the assessors looking for? And do you have any obligation to kind of, poke at that and look for possible interactions with systems that are outside the scope of the assessment?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and keep notes.
A lot of questions, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so and that kind of gets back to the prep that I talked about from a pre-assessment and readiness assessment, is making sure that boundary is well defined. This isn't going to be something that is not vetted, is not, as you mentioned, kind of poked at. So from a C3PO and assessor perspective, that is something that's going to need to be validated. And I was going to use the same answer that you talked about, referencing the interim rule, really following the data of where it goes. And that's what I talked about, the relationship with third parties, be those, outsourced providers or even potentially other government contractors, subcontractors, and so forth, is following that data and where it goes and what should be in scope for your specific organization, and so forth. So there is a process by which you present the boundary, and it does need to be validated prior to an assessment starting, so that everybody is on the same page about what that boundary should and could be. And as you mentioned, kind of the three different ways that you can do it from an entity-wide perspective, I think will be very beneficial, probably for the smaller folks, to just get it done, overarching and kind of have a pervasive controls across an entity. That's not going to be possible for a lot of other contractors. Let's be honest. One, there's many that do work well beyond the DoD, and there's many that do work well beyond the government space. So you talked about kind of those other two options of DoD specific, or even this enclave approach, is something to take into consideration. And that stuff should all be vetted during that readiness / pre-assessment phase, in my opinion. So there are no questions. And then kind of the fourth, I would say, you mentioned the three, I kind of think of a fourth option as a hybrid approach, meaning there are organizations, maybe there's a potential fifth too, which is kind of getting around it. And I'll talk to that in a second. But the fourth kind of hybrid approach is, there's some thought that maybe at an entity level, you get, level 1 at the entity. And then DoD specific or enclave, you may have a level 3. So that if, contract FCI, the federal contract information, is hitting elsewhere in the entity, and that's all that's being touched there, then that could be fine with a level 1 certification, versus when it gets the CUI, that maybe it's, contained within an enclave, for example. So I would just throw that out there, that there's, somewhat of a hybrid approach that could potentially be possible. The other thing, just something to keep in mind, and this is by no means a guarantee. This is just something to keep in mind. I guess I'll just disclaim like that, is that there's some thought that subcontractors, depending on the work that they're providing, how many really need access to level 3 CUI data? And could they still perform on a contract either at a level 1 or no levels? And by that, I mean, there is the possibility that a prime contractor, for example, could provide access to a subcontractor in the prime's certified environment. So the subs are only accessing the FCI at level 1 or CUI at level 3 in a prime environment. That's completely outside of my realm. Those are relationships and agreements that would need to be made between contractors, but it is permissible, is my point. And there's some other thoughts on, depending on what you are doing from a subcontractor perspective, if you do not need FCI and CUI and merely could act upon, you could still support the contract, but by way of acting upon something like a purchase order that's not specific to, DoD military space specs. Is that something where you would not need to be certified from just a purchase order perspective of maybe, developing a widget? And there's possibilities there too. So kind of you have those four to include the hybrid, and then there's a fifth. I'm not saying it's an option, but something to consider for folks, depending on the exact work, is whether or not you really need to be certified. And if not, how are you able to still, help in this case, prime contractors, and there are certain things to take into consideration there that maybe those conversations can be being had now to see if that is a possibility with some of the folks you work with. Just something to put out there. I've talked to primes and some said, absolutely no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to open up any of our environment to a sub in that capacity. And we've talked to others that said, oh, absolutely, it's something we're considering because, you know, we may deal with a subcontractor that plays a very important role, but they're a 12-person company, and the likelihood of them being able to make the investment into, level X, 1, 2, 3, whatever it may be, is pretty slim. So we'd rather just, take it upon us and we'll provide access.
Very good. One of the audience questions was around, are there any barriers to the sort of the enclave concept? And I think we've seen that now your statements corroborate this, but I think the DFARS clause also somewhat suggests that that's an acceptable alternative, up to the contractor to define it.
Yeah.
And the CMMC standard says that it's up to the contractor to define it, and any creative way that they can come up with, I think, as long as they can demonstrate that. Sounds like. Yeah. I had a fairly lengthy question about. I want to circle back on the exception in the POAM process. I had a fairly lengthy question, but I'm out of time, so I'm going to ask an audience question, which is a simpler version of what I had come up with. Do you think there will be any kind of a soft start on the pass-fail metrics?
No.
Asked and answered. Okay, that's a no. And I would have to concur. I think that's what we heard from Katie Arrington, is that no, they're really not looking at exceptions. She did put in some language. If you want to go back and listen to our session, anybody who's curious about the details there, she did talk about notions of exceptions around, contractor flow down, that they're not going to stop a huge multi-billion-dollar acquisition because one contractor didn't get certified. So she kind of talked about that piece, but the idea of getting a certification, good housekeeping seal of approval, without having 100% of the items, I think the answer we've been hearing has been a pretty consistent no. I want to jump to kind of a closing question because we're already at the end of our time. And at the end of these sessions, I always like to give my guests a chance to give kind of their number one piece of feedback. So one of the stated purposes of this provisional assessor training, as you mentioned, Neal, was to get feedback. And we know from past experience that the accreditation body has been spending a really good deal of their time soliciting and listening to and responding industry feedback. I mean, I think there's been a lot of interaction in this process, which has been pleasant to see. So after going through the training, what's your number one piece of constructive feedback, either on the training or the CMMC program in general, as you see it now starting to become reality for your piece of it?
Again, I graduated with a finance degree, so I still consider myself somewhat of a numbers guy. And because of that, when you do the math of the number of assessments that are expected to go through in the next 5 years, and by the way, that's based on the number of anticipated RFPs to hit over the 5-year period, and then starting in 2026, there'll be in every RFP, the CMMC requirement. But a lot of that doesn't take into consideration. There's going to be plenty of folks that get assessed that aren't awarded a contract for whatever reason. They want to get out in front of it, or they're not awarded a contract. So when you start doing the simple math of assessments needing to happen for the DIB, which they've estimated at over 300,000. The legwork that's going to need to go into getting folks prepared, as well as the assessments themselves. And Ed, you and I have talked, and I've heard you reference it before, the FedRAMP process, obviously, undoubtedly a heavier lift overall, but the fact that I think they've gotten through 200 people in 8 years, and they're looking at, hundreds of thousands of government contractors getting through CMMC in a 5+ year period. It's still mind-blowing to me and pretty aggressive. But as I mentioned earlier, COVID withstanding, they've been pretty spot on and have held to a timeline that most others would have seen pushed farther to the right. So my advice would be to for the AB to just especially when this interim rule gets formally and finally approved, to just put the gas the hammer down on training folks and getting folks out there, without diluting the process, because one of their goals is really to have uniformity across this. They want a level 3 assessment that's performed out in San Francisco to look the same as one that's performed in Reston, look and feel the same and have the same degree of scrutiny and level of detail and so forth. And that's why the training is so important. So the more folks they can get trained and turn around and satisfy really the demand that's out there in the industry, I think is paramount. So just getting more folks through the process, listening to feedback, and incorporating it. Everybody knows you can solicit feedback all you want, but if you don't act on it, what's really the value in that? And so hopefully they are taking a lot of considerations from what they're hearing, both from industry and not just the assessors, but the OSCs themselves. They've said it's affordable. They said it's doable for everyone. Only time will tell if it is, but they need to take consideration to potentially adjust some things if the feedback is pointing in that direction.
Neal, thank you very much. This is really excellent and very new information just out from the training last week. So appreciate it, you getting it out to all of our audience. I apologize to the audience. I didn't get to all the questions. There was a big audience today and a lot of questions. So we'll probably address some of the assessment details in a future session. I would encourage you to join us for future town hall sessions. Our next session will be next Wednesday, October 14th. So we're doing these generally every week at 1 p.m. Eastern. I also want to mention two upcoming events. We have one of which has changed. So on October 26th to 28th, we have Uniting Women in Cyber. It's a full day and 2 half days of very highly packed, content-packed time frame. So definitely check that out. It's going to explore many issues around cybersecurity, not just CMMC. And then we have a cybersecurity summit that we're doing in conjunction with Federal Publications Seminars. That has moved to November 17th. So the previous date was in October. That has moved to November 17th. Please update your calendars and go to our website for the latest information on these events if you don't have the details. So thanks very much for your time and attention, and look forward to seeing you in the future to delve into more CMMC topics. Thank you.